One war in the Middle East is now showing up at African gas pumps, in Caribbean threat warnings, and in the language world leaders use when they want escalation to sound measured. So are these really separate stories, or are we watching one conflict spill outward until the whole news cycle bends around it? Today, we're pulling together several reports that don't look connected until you put them side by side. Iran's war is hammering fuel prices across Africa. Trump is threatening another strike, then pausing it, then warning again. Cuba is being framed as a possible new pressure point. Lebanon and Gaza are still being hit despite all the talk of ceasefires. And over in Asia, Taiwan is hearing a version of the same message: stay in line or the consequences get much bigger. The articles give us the facts. The interesting part is what they don't spell out. If you're getting value from this breakdown, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Let's start with a story that barely gets treated like a war story at all. According to the reporting, the US and Israeli strikes on Iran did not stay contained to the region where they happened. They hit the global energy market almost immediately, and Africa has been one of the first places where that shock became impossible to ignore. In South Africa, schools are reportedly closing because buses can't get fuel. In Tanzania, the president has cut her motorcade down and pushed officials onto shared buses to conserve diesel. Madagascar has declared an energy emergency. Somalia's fishing fleet is docked because crews can't afford fuel, and that means the food supply is now getting squeezed too. That last detail matters more than it may sound. A lot of mainstream coverage treats fuel prices like an abstract chart, but in the real world, higher diesel prices don't just mean inconvenience. They mean buses stop running, food gets more expensive, fertilizer stops moving, aid shipments slow down, and governments start panicking over budgets they were already struggling to hold together. In Kenya, the article says protests broke out after fuel prices jumped hard, with 4 people killed during the unrest. The government then cut value-added tax to bring pump prices down a bit. That sounds like policy management, but it also reads like damage control after a decision taken thousands of miles away.
And that's the part that gets buried. The dominant framing is usually global market volatility. That sounds neutral, almost weather-like. But this wasn't weather. This was the result of a military escalation that disrupted shipping, insurance, refinery access, and confidence in one of the most important waterways on Earth. When the Strait of Hormuz becomes unstable, the whole world pays, but poorer countries pay first and hardest. Ghana is another example. Officials there are reportedly subsidizing fuel at a real cost to the state, while jet fuel prices threaten the country's airport ambitions. Malawi is dealing with fertilizer shortages. Uganda has seen price spikes too. Nigeria, despite producing oil, still has queues because it exports raw energy and imports refined fuel. That's the kind of structural weakness that gets exposed the second the world gets tense. Different outlets and officials interpret that pain differently. One analyst calls it a systemic seizure. A Burundian fuel dealer says Africa is not a bystander. A Ghanaian minister says tanker insurance costs are landing directly in Accra. An Ethiopian official says families are choosing between transport and food. Those are not isolated complaints. They're a map of consequence. And it's worth asking a blunt question. If a war causes this much damage outside the battlefield, at what point do we stop calling the resulting crisis indirect? The answer from governments is usually to pretend the pain is unfortunate but unavoidable. Yet the choice to strike, to threaten shipping, to keep the pressure campaign alive, all of that was made by people who will not be waiting in the fuel line tomorrow morning. Now to the center of the story, Iran. The latest reports say Tehran sent back a new proposal meant to end the war, and that indirect talks are still happening through Pakistan and Oman. Iranian officials are describing the response as serious, structured, and tied to confidence-building steps. On the US side, the response is much sharper. One senior official said Iran needs to throw out some candy, which is a pretty casual way to talk about a conflict that could set the entire region on fire. Then Trump posted that the clock is ticking, before saying he had postponed a planned strike at the request of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. That sequence tells you a lot.
It shows that the administration is still using the same method it always uses in these situations: pressure, deadline, threat, pause, repeat. Call it diplomacy if you want, but it looks a lot more like coercive bargaining under military shadow. The point is not simply to negotiate. The point is to keep the other side off balance while making the threat of force feel normal. Iran, for its part, is not pretending this is business as usual. Its leaders are saying dialogue does not mean surrender. They're also warning that the US presence in the region creates insecurity instead of preventing it. That line may sound like rhetoric, but it's backed by what the articles describe. Drone strikes near the UAE nuclear plant, Saudi Arabia intercepting drones from Iraq, tanker movements slipping through blockade pressure, and Iran creating a new body to manage the Strait of Hormuz. That new Hormuz authority is important because it suggests Tehran is trying to formalize control over the choke point instead of pretending the shipping crisis is temporary. When one side makes the waterway into a battlefield and the other side responds by building a bureaucracy around it, that's not a sign of calm. That's a sign the conflict has entered a new phase. There's also a big gap between how the public is told this is going and how it actually sounds in the reporting. Trump says the Gulf states asked him to hold off because they believe a deal can still be reached. Yet the same reporting says military options are still on the table and that another attack could happen on a moment's notice. Those two ideas can't both be reassuring. Either negotiations are real, or the negotiations are cover for a war that has merely been delayed. And the delay itself is revealing. If the Gulf states really pressed for a pause, that means even Washington's regional partners understand what a new strike could trigger. retaliation, shipping disruption, damaged infrastructure, and maybe attacks on airports or desalination plants. In other words, the very people calling for restraint are doing so because they know escalation doesn't stay neatly in one country.
One more thing that deserves more attention. The U.S. insurance program for ships transiting Hormuz reportedly hasn't paid out anything, even though it was launched as part of this whole pressure architecture. That's a perfect example of the gap between the public story and the real machinery. Announce a grand policy, create the appearance of control, then discover the logistics don't work and the market doesn't care. So when officials talk about stability, what they often mean is temporary compliance under threat. Next comes Cuba, and this is where the pattern gets very familiar. President Miguel Díaz-Canel warned that any U.S. attack would be a bloodbath and that even the threat itself is already an international crime. That is strong language, but it comes in response to reporting that sounds less like evidence and more like pretext building. According to one of the articles, U.S. officials were floating claims that Cuba's military had discussed drones, including possible responses involving Guantanamo Bay, U.S. ships, or even Key West. But the same report also admits Washington does not believe Cuba is an imminent threat. That detail is doing a lot of work. If there's no imminent threat, then why is the story being framed in a way that makes escalation feel available? Because the point may not be to respond to danger. The point may be to create the conditions where pressure feels justified later. That's where the older grievance enters the picture. The Justice Department is reportedly considering an indictment tied to the 1996 shoot-down of planes belonging to a Cuban exile group. That's a real historical event, but it's also a very old one. Bringing it back now, alongside drone speculation and naval warnings, looks less like the pursuit of justice and more like the assembly of a legal and moral bridge to a new confrontation. And Cuba already knows what this story tends to become. The island has endured a tightening oil embargo, severe humanitarian strain, and a long campaign of pressure from Washington. So when mainstream coverage presents the U.S. as simply reacting to a Cuban threat, it leaves out the larger context. The pressure has been building for years, and the suffering has been measurable for years too.
This is where the rhetoric gets slippery. U.S. officials describe possible military measures as deterrence. Cuban officials describe the same thing as aggression. The difference isn't just political spin. It's the difference between a government presenting itself as the victim of instability and a government that may be actively manufacturing that instability. There's also a larger regional lesson here. The same logic that turned sanctions, embargoes, and defensive measures into normalized tools in the Middle East is now being repackaged for the Caribbean. Different geography, same pattern. Isolate, pressure, hint at force, wait for justification, then act surprised when the targeted country starts preparing its own response. And that response is always treated as the story itself. While all of that is unfolding, the war in Lebanon and Gaza just keeps grinding on. The reporting says Israeli strikes killed at least 37 in Lebanon after a ceasefire extension, with the overall toll passing 3,000 dead and more than 9,000 wounded. There are also repeated claims that the strikes are aimed at Hezbollah positions, yet the articles say evidence is rarely offered in a way the public can verify. Among the dead are women, children, and paramedics. There are also reports of an assassination of a Palestinian Islamic Jihad commander and his teenage daughter in eastern Lebanon, well beyond the usual southern border zones people associate with the conflict. That matters because it blows a hole in the idea that this is a tightly contained conflict with surgical objectives. If a ceasefire is being extended on paper while attacks continue in practice, then ceasefire is functioning as a public relations term, not a real limit on violence. Gaza tells a similar story. Strikes continue, civilians keep dying, and the language used by officials often sounds clean enough to hide the human cost. The coverage mentions commanders, infrastructure, and security. It rarely lingers on what a war of this duration does to a population that has nowhere to go and no meaningful escape route. Now zoom out one level and the geopolitical picture gets even stranger.
At the same time, this war is destabilizing the Middle East. Putin and Xi are meeting again and describing their partnership as a stabilizing force. That might sound like standard summit theater, but it sits in direct contrast to the U.S. story of managing the world through pressure and punishment. Moscow and Beijing are presenting themselves as defenders of sovereignty and multilateral order, even while each has its own record that makes that claim easier to question. Still, the diplomatic message is clear. The world is not lining up behind one unquestioned center of power anymore. Taiwan sits in the middle of that shift. Trump told Taiwan not to go independent and said he doesn't want the U.S. fighting a war 9,500 miles away. That line got attention because it sounded like restraint, but it also sounded transactional. Taiwan is being treated not just as a partner, but as leverage in a bigger bargaining game with China. That's the part the headlines don't like to say out loud. These crises are not separate. They are all part of the same pressure system. Threaten one region to signal another, use one war to discipline another negotiation, and keep the public focused on the latest flashpoint instead of the architecture underneath it. The people making the decisions call that strategy. The people living through it call it cost. The big takeaway is that the Iran war is no longer just a regional conflict. It's hitting fuel prices, food supply, and transportation far beyond the battlefield. Another key point is that the diplomatic process around Iran is being run under constant threat, which makes it hard to tell where negotiations end and coercion begins. Cuba is being positioned through old grievances and speculative claims in a way that looks more like pretext building than an immediate response to danger. Lebanon and Gaza show that ceasefires can exist in name while violence continues in practice. And the broader global picture is becoming more fragmented, with China, Russia, Taiwan, and the Gulf states all reacting to a world where U.S. pressure still matters, but no longer goes uncontested.
The common thread here is not chaos for its own sake. It's a political system that keeps exporting risk and then acting surprised when the costs come home.
Drop a comment with the one part of today's story you think is being most underreported, because I want to hear which angle you think the media is missing. If this kind of breakdown helps you see the bigger picture, like the video, subscribe, and come back for the next one.